Greetings. Welcome back to Black Bear News, where we are discussing climate change, abrupt climate change, and things adjacent. And I have with me today the esteemed Guy McPherson, Dr. Guy McPherson, Professor Emeritus at the University of Arizona. Yes.
Yes.
And good to have you back, Guy. It's been a long time since we talked.
Yeah. Thank you, Kevin. It's good to chat with you today.
Yeah. And we already kind of. We're talking about a few things, but you did. We were briefly talking about your conversation with Wisławski. Is his last name?
Wisławski.
Oh, okay, Wisławski, who is an expert on ice and ice extent and what's happening in the Arctic, and so the interesting thing about that conversation that I thought you seemed a bit skeptical of what he was trying to say, that we were okay, that we're not going to see a blue ocean event until 2030 or 2035 or
right,
something like that, something to that.
I agree that we might have a few more years, and I think he's being conservative for at least three different reasons. One, he was the lead author on the paper in the Annual Review of Earth and Planetary Sciences titled "The Future of Arctic Sea Ice," in which they projected with a linear projection an ice-free Arctic in 2016, plus or minus 3 years. And he said it's almost certainly not going to happen this year. And this is the last of the 7 years that fit within that projection. And so I think he's being conservative because they sort of got burned. He and his co-authors made this linear projection, and it's almost certainly not going to play out this year. So I think he's backing off quite a bit as a result of that. And because he's an academic, he's a scientist, and scientists are very conservative by their nature. And he's paid by the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School. So there's three reasons right there that he might be conservative, and I appreciate all of that. I still think that we could experience an ice-free Arctic in considerably less than the 2030 that he pitched out there, that it could very well be within the next few years. In fact, I follow it pretty closely. Every day or two, I check the volume and the extent, and it looks really ugly right now. It's a very fragile situation with very little old sea ice, older than a year or two. So it looks to me like things are not healthy with respect to the sea ice in the Arctic. And I have been relying upon that paper, so perhaps what I've got here is a little bit of confirmation bias. And in addition, I'm trying to encourage people to live with urgency as if our days are numbered. And so maybe that adds to the confirmation bias. But I'm ecstatic if he concludes, and then I ask him, what about a prediction? And he started getting really fidgety and refused to make a prediction. I can certainly understand that. So his group has put together a model that predicts up to 6 months in advance. This was mid-April when I was talking to him. So that takes us to mid-October, and I asked him, so what's the scoop? Through mid-October, that takes us through the end of the melt season for this year. And he said, almost certainly not going to happen, or almost certainly not going to have an ice-free Arctic this year. So that's all very good news. And I take it with a grain of salt, given the conservative nature of the position that he's in. So I don't doubt that we'll get through this year and with an ice-free, I don't doubt that we'll get through this year without having an ice-free Arctic. I threw in a few too many double negatives there, but I think we'll have ice in the Arctic this year in any event. And I view that as very good news. If we can keep that going for another few years, I'd be ecstatic. That and the many other means by which we can cause our own loss of habitat, cause our own functional extinction.
Yeah. I'm happy about that news too. If that news is true, or if that's something that,
you'd have to be really misanthropic to view that as bad news.
Right.
And right. Only that, you'd have to hate all life on Earth. There's a paper by Strona and Bradshaw that came out, when was that? November 13th of last year, I think it was, in Scientific Reports. And they concluded that a 5 or 6 degrees Celsius global average temperature rise could cause, according to their model, will cause the loss of all life on Earth, the annihilation of all life on Earth. And almost certainly, because of the exacerbation of self-reinforcing feedback loops that are occurring in the Arctic right now, almost certainly the loss of Arctic ice would lead to that 5 or 6 degrees Celsius global average temperature rise, probably closer to 6 than 5.
But don't you think it happens even earlier than that? I mean, you know,
It,
when they're saying, when even the IPCC is saying the 2C is the threshold we cannot pass, because that already kicks everything, you know, at 2 or 3C,
right.
it's
Right.
limited amount of time.
You know, it's interesting that the IPCC, which is a United Nations organization, fails to admit what the United Nations Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases pointed out in October of 1990, that 1 degree C was the absolute upper limit.
Which,
so,
yeah.
you know, the goalposts keep getting moved back we keep shifting the baseline. Now the Industrial Revolution didn't begin in 1750 or 1850. It began last Tuesday, as nearly as I can tell.
Right.
Or maybe next Tuesday.
1984. No. 1993. No. Yes.
So the ever-changing baseline and the ever-changing adherence to the precautionary principle seems to be leading to our demise in the not-too-distant future, regardless.
Right. Yes. And so, so dealing with that, how, you know, where are we actually at? So I hear a lot of conversation about where we're at as far as the actual global temperature. You know, are we at 1.65 or 1.8? Are we at 2? Are we 1 point? You know, the official version is, you know, we're at 0.9 or we're at 1 or something.
Right. Right. Which, of course, is a result of shifting that baseline and moving it forward. But I turn to Sam Carana, who wisely uses a pseudonym when he writes, or when she writes, or when they write. In any event, we don't know who that is. But Carana produced an excellent analysis more than 2 years ago. I believe it was early April 2017, concluding that we were at 1.73 degrees Celsius above the 1750 baseline then. That was 2 years ago. Obviously, it's warmed up since then. The planet is not cooling off, contrary to what the crazy Ice Age Maunder minimum wackos are talking about. So I suspect, I haven't seen an analysis since then from Grana or anybody else. And because the shifting the goalposts and changing the so-called baseline keeps going on, it's hard for me to tell, but I guess that we're at a lot closer to 1.8 than we are to 1.7. And we're certainly not at 1 or 1.2 or 1.5 or these other ridiculous numbers that I hear.
Right. Which makes, you know, not crossing 1.5 is obviously, you know, in the rearview mirror. Even though that's the official story, we can't cross 1.5. You know.
I know. In fact, there's this paper that came out in April of 2019. It's called Global Trends to 2030, Challenges and Choices for Europe. It's put out by the European Strategy and Policy Analysis System. It's this synthetic work that relies on a bunch of peer-reviewed information. And here's the bottom line. I think it's from page 8. An increase of 1.5 degrees. That's 1.5 degrees over the 1750 baseline.
Right.
So an increase of 1.5 degrees is the maximum the planet can tolerate. Should temperatures increase further, we will face even more droughts, floods, extreme heat, poverty, and at worst, the extinction of humankind altogether. End quote. Well, we're well past 1.5.
Yeah.
And they refuse to admit it in this paper. And that doesn't mean it's not true just because they don't admit it.
Right.
So it could very well be that we have triggered the death by 1,000 cuts as a result of being over that 1.5. And in fact, there's a paper by Burke and colleagues in the December 26th, 2018 issue of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that here's a direct quote from the study. Our study suggests that climates like those of the Pliocene will prevail as soon as 2030. The Pliocene, the mid-Pliocene, it was 2 to 3 degrees Celsius warmer than it is right now. So
Yeah.
that's what we're talking about when we talk about abrupt rates of change.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's real soon, 2030.
Right. So they mentioned 2030 in the synthetic report put out by the European Strategy and Policy Analysis. Both mentioned 2030. Well, one of them says we got to keep it below 1.5 through 2030, and the other one says we're headed for the Pliocene as early as 2030. This just doesn't match up.
Right. And how much weight or validity do you give to the Sam Carana kind of timelines of, 10 degrees by 2026 or something like that? Or, I mean, it kind of goes from, 8 degrees Celsius more to 10 or possibly 18,
Well, Carana added on a new self-reinforcing feedback loop that results from the stripping away of clouds in the atmosphere.
Right.
And this is relatively recently, within the last 3 months, I would say, and added on 8 degrees to the previous 10.02 degrees by 2026. So he says we're headed for this number that is well beyond what this planet has experienced in the last 2 billion years. How much credence do I lead to that? Well, I haven't included that latest self-reinforcing feedback loop into my work because it might take longer than that to play out. It's associated with such a high carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, or the equivalent thereof, that I'm not sure it's going to happen by 2030. If it does, we'll never know it, and I don't think there will be a human being making measurements in 2030 regardless.
Right.
So the earlier work that Carana had done was outstanding. The one where he concluded 10.02, and I think he made one error in there, and I took a more conservative route than he did in a couple of cases, and I came up with only 8.7 above the 1750 baseline by 2026. Neither of those is survivable by humans,
right?
In my informed opinion, because we depend upon so many other species that are going to go extinct.
Right.
Long before that, with that rapid rate of change. In fact, even the 8.7 in that short a period of time, according to the paper by Strona and Bradshaw, is sufficient to cause the annihilation of all life on Earth. So I think Carana has done some fantastic work. I think he's out there really pushing the envelope, and I think it's very, very good to read his work and listen to what he is saying. And I tend to be slightly more conservative, and I'm still judged as a whack job because I'm not conservative enough.
Right. Well, and then also, if you take into account the other thing that people talk about is not just the CO2 concentration in the air, but the CO2 equivalent of all the greenhouse gases being something in the 500s. I don't even know what the number is. It's just so high.
It's well over 600.
Okay. Well then, yeah. Which is, so we're just waiting for the lag, the time lag, we're waiting for that to
Right. And remember when 320 was the upper limit, or maybe 350? This is from James Hansen in 1988 on the floor of Congress.
Right.
And 320 or 350, and you don't even hear James Hansen talking much about how far behind we've left those goalposts. He's talking about what we can do now, and it almost always involves reducing emissions, but he knows better. He knows that reducing emissions comes with a cost that also removes the aerosols that are keeping us cool. So this is the catch-22 that even he refuses to talk about.
Right. Well, so this is something I'd like to talk about. This is kind of something, a main thrust of this interview that I wanted to bring up. So there's, and I talk about it on my show a lot, possible paths forward. So, understanding the science and understanding the dire situation and understanding, the futility of trying to do something to mitigate our situation, or the direness of our situation. There are a lot of people talking about possible, solutions. There's Drawdown, the book Drawdown. Is it Paul Hawken?
Paul Hawken, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then I just, there are a few people out there talking about different ideas. I just actually watched a pretty interesting video by a guy named Walter, I think it's Jenny or Jen from Australia, talking about re-establishing hydrological cycles. And he is leaving some of the predicament, items out of his work, but it's intriguing, because he's talking about the, if you green, a certain areas, if you green areas enough and do it in a certain way, you can actually lower the temperature. He's talking about Canberra, Australia being basically 7°C lower than other cities and heat islands. And it's, he actually goes in depth about, trying to counteract the heat and the carbon that's in the ocean. What, he's like, I know, this is a hard, long road to do this. And this is also assuming that everybody's going to go, okay, let's go this way, like.
Which I think is great, by the way. And
Yeah.
I was recently contacted by an engineer from Harvard, some institute at Harvard. I forget the name of it, much to my embarrassment. And he was talking about a means by which we could mitigate for the loss of the aerosol masking effect, or for the loss of global dimming. And he's an engineer, and he's clearly been thinking about this for a long time. He'd run some numbers. And so I thought that was awesome. I'm not going to encourage people to slow down on taking action that might actually prevent our extinction. And it's not just our extinction, it's the extinction of all life on Earth, because when we go, the loss of global dimming ratchets up the rate of change so fast that it's difficult for me to imagine many species could make it through that bottleneck. And then there's also the catastrophic uncontrolled meltdown of the world's nuclear power facilities,
right,
with no humans around to keep an eye on them. So I've been working with this guy a little bit, this engineer at Harvard, and giving him some names, and he's making the connections and trying to get a little workshop going so that we can take a more integrative and holistic approach to the whole thing. Because the typical approach in academia is to focus on one piece, on one little piece, and spend your entire career working on one little piece.
Right.
And you see that you see exceptions in Carana's work, for example, which is one of the things I love about that work, is that he puts together the research from Wadhams on Arctic sea ice, and from Shakova and her research team on the methane release, and so on. And he adds these things together, which almost no climate scientists are willing to do.
Right. Yeah. I mean, factoring in all the processes that are going on, and putting that together, and how they interact with each other. And, this, can you speak a little bit about what this engineer, what his possible solution is for global dimming? Because I have never heard anybody say, this is how we deal with global dimming.
Right. Well, I'm not going to talk about it because I don't know that he wants it in the public sphere. Okay. Before we have a conversation among other climate scientists. The one suggestion I've seen from anybody that is supported by both Carana and Peter Wadhams is the marine cloud brightening. I don't know if you've heard of that. Mm-hmm. But basically it's taking a bunch of pumps out into the Arctic Ocean and pumping seawater as high as we can get it. And that would provide brightened clouds over the marine area that would reflect incoming radiation. Now, I don't think that's feasible, because civilization is a heat engine, and that furthers the heat engine that is civilization that takes us to Pliocene as early as 2030, according to this paper by Burke and colleagues. And in addition, the heating in the Arctic is occurring from below as well as from above. So just because you can put some sort of tent over the top of it, clouds or whatever,
right,
that doesn't mean it's not going to be heated from below. The Washington Post even ran a story on this a few months ago about the Arctic Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean becoming one, and all these species moving further north into the Arctic where they've never been seen before because they're Atlantic Ocean species. So I think there's a couple of problems with that, and that's why I think even though the idea has been out there for probably 5 years, nobody's pursuing it. Nobody with any real power or influence is saying that's the thing we need to do to save the lives of my grandchildren. Therefore, I'm going to throw all this money at it. I haven't seen that at all.
Well, and it does sound like a weird idea to me. To me, it doesn't sound very feasible. It doesn't, logistically, on a physical level, like how are you gonna? I'm gonna go into a little territory that might be, a little taboo on your end. I don't know, but what about creating? I think only from my own physical observation and have no other data on this at all. But I think that they can create clouds, are creating clouds to to keep the sun from baking us all to death on certain days. And I'm not talking about geoengineering, because I don't believe in the whole chemtrail, like they're spraying us, they're doing all, I don't believe that part of the whole thing. But on a clear day in LA, you can see this kind of happening quite a bit.
Wait. You just said on a clear day in LA.
On a clear, starts out as a clear day. What starts out as a clear day? This is what I mean. Clear morning, you wake up and you see, some trails, and then all of a sudden by the afternoon, you have this cloud cover. That's just my own observation, and it's uncanny how it kind of follows the arc of the sun across the sky. And so I'm not, my only conclusion I can draw from this is I get the sense that, something is happening, that, they're creating some kind of cloud cover because it's cooling the area. And obviously, okay, we want to extrapolate this globally, what a ridiculous idea, because you'd have to do this globally. But I actually hear from a lot of my viewers and a lot of other people that they witness the same kind of things happening. And because contrails are natural, because they do happen, it would be easy to create these, create things that are not natural and kind of slide them in there, put them in the slots, Yeah,
we know about the contrail effect. We learned a lot about it after 9/11. When the scientists went out on 9/14 and measured a vastly different temperature signature at the level of the planet. So the contrail effect, I don't think you'll find anybody who disagrees that there's an impact from condensation trails in terms of the temperature. The difficulty I have is taking that conversation beyond. There's a lot more airplanes flying today than there were 10 years ago and 20 years ago and 30 years ago.
Right.
And there's also a lot more moisture in the atmosphere. If we're at, say, 1.8 degrees Celsius above the 1750 baseline, we know that every 1 degree causes 7% increase in atmospheric moisture.
Right.
So the contrail effect is undoubtedly greater as a result of two factors: more airplanes and more moisture in the air, than it was not very long ago. And so I think that's all I want to say on that topic. And
okay,
let the flaming begin.
So let's say, but so let's say that this is something that somebody at Harvard thinks is a good idea, or something that the military is willing to say, okay, well, if we create clouds, we're not talking about anything that's going on right now. We're talking about in the future. So, as a possible reduction of,
Right. Let me talk about there actually is a faculty member at Harvard, David Keith,
right,
who, with support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, is spraying the skies maybe right now or last month over New Mexico, maybe Arizona, with heavy metals to try to block the sun locally initially. And obviously that's where any geoengineering attempt is going to have its impact initially, is at the local level. And I think it's odd that, or maybe not, that is even being pursued, because there's abundant research on this topic and leading to synthetic analyses and results by the United States National Academy of Sciences in, I think it was February 2015, and then by a European body of similar significance in summer of that year, 2015, and both of which concluded that geoengineering, and the focus was specifically on mitigating for the aerosol masking effect through solar radiation management.
Right.
They both of these synthetic reports concluded that that was a bad idea. It would probably make the situation worse and probably wouldn't improve the situation. So, but that's an indication of how desperate the times are, I suppose.
Sure.
Is that we've clearly entered the arena of exponential climate change or runaway climate change, and so if you have essentially an unlimited amount of money and therefore access to somebody like David Keith, maybe you'll try anything. Maybe
Right.
you'll bring in the guy in the bottom of the 11th to throw one pitch, right? Thinking that it might do something. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, and that's why you have people talking about marine cloud brightening and, solar radiation management and, whatever other ideas are out there. I mean, I guess I have somewhat of a skeptical, possibly conspiratorial nature, so I don't actually, but when the military or the official bodies say like, why would we do that? I don't put them past them, don't put it past them to be doing that, just that thing,
Right.
and
Absolutely.
the official narrative is, oh no.
Absolutely. I am not willing to believe without evidence anybody, and that certainly includes the United States government. Come on. In
Right.
the United States military industrial, what Dwight Eisenhower called the military industrial congressional complex in the first mini drafts of that speech before it was finally taken out, because you can't offend Congress on your way out the door. But he's right. He was right, and it's still correct. It is the military industrial congressional complex. It's this group of people, and there's not very many of them, who have considerable influence over what happens in our daily lives and in our weekly lives and so on. And I don't trust any of those people with anything, certainly not with my so-called Social Security. I mean, come on.
Right. Yeah, and I guess that's what also inspires a lot of fear from people regarding possible fixes, handing over, whatever bumbling huge mistakes, that we could make doing this kind of stuff to government bodies that have already shown that they're fully capable of making huge bumbling mistakes on our behalf and on the Earth's behalf. And they've, done a fine job already.
Absolutely. And so I'm not very trustworthy when it comes to government entities, and certainly not corporate entities. I know what they're about. They're about the money for the relatively few people. That's not hard to see.
Right.
You don't need to be a conspiracy theorist to see that the settled living arrangements is really about the privilege of a relatively minor number of people. So when you reach that conclusion, then you can conclude almost anything that is nefarious about the government, the corporations, and how they're working hand in hand with each other. In fact, it becomes difficult to not see it everywhere. Maybe I'm seeing it in places that it doesn't exist.
Right.
How would I know?
Well, that's the argument that I make to, if I address, deniers or people that are in the climate change is a hoax camp. I try to tell them, look, it's not the conspiracy is not that it's a hoax. The conspiracy is that they're not telling you how bad it is, or what deep trouble we're in, and they're just trying to hide that from you for as long as possible. And at the last moment, you're going to be like, oh, dang it.
It reminds me of that Frank Zappa quote. I don't remember exactly how it goes, but he talks about when the screen goes up, or when they remove the veil and everybody sees what's behind it, right?
Yes. Yeah,
that's when
I know this
quote. So far they're keeping us distracted with little moves.
There's a brick wall behind the curtains. When they pull back the curtains, you'll see the brick wall. Bam. Yeah. Exactly. So I wanted to also ask you, okay, another I suppose controversial subject. So you have been putting out a message for quite a few years about the dire state of our planet And as the climate catastrophe progresses, more people are kind of echoing your the things that you have been saying for so long. I find that more people are moving to your understanding of the situation rather than away as time goes on. So, and you have more scientists, more journalists, more regular people like me just understanding, oh my God, this is what the situation is. And you have people taking different routes to address this information, not just in possible mitigation, but you also have Extinction Rebellion, you have the climate school strikes, you have and I was just listening to a little bit of your interview with Roger Hallam. This is a few months ago. Everybody was sending that to me like yesterday, and I was like, wait a minute, I didn't even know this. This has happened in December. I didn't even hear about this. So, and I'm a fan. I'm a fan of Roger Hallam's work. I really, I like. He's basically, saying the same story, telling the same story. Like, this is how bad it is. His conclusion, is that we must, fight the forces, fight the power,
Right.
and
Power
so
to the people, stick it to the man. Power to the people, stick it to the
right. Well, and then you also have Jem Bendell talking about deep adaptation, and I'm not clear, what that actually is as a concept. Like deep adaptation to what? I don't. And I'm not saying, I'm not discounting his idea. I'm just saying, I mean, he's saying deep adaptation is better than hopium, I suppose. And I don't really.
Right. Both of those guys know about the aerosol masking effect, and they both lie by omission in never mentioning it. And Jim Bendell is he won't even allow the word extinction to appear in his group conversations. Not even the word extinction, because deep adaptation is going to save us. No, it's not. Deep adaptation is a trick, as nearly as I can tell. Deep adaptation is what I did when I moved off grid. That's deep adaptation. That's what he's talking about, is people growing their own food and all these other things that I did. And then I became cognizant of the full effect of the aerosol masking effect. And I realized no point, because even really smart, deeply adaptive humans will not survive on a dead planet. That's where we're going.
Yeah.
And this paper by Strona and Bradshaw points out, Strona was quoted in an Australian news outlet the following day, the day after it was published, on the 13th of November, 2018. So on the 14th of November, he says, our paper demonstrates that even the most tolerant of species ultimately succumb to extinction when the less tolerant species on which they depend disappear. He's talking about humans. We depend upon a vast network of life. And when enough of those pieces go away, we're done. We can't adapt without food, without filter feeders to clean our water, without pollinators, without all these things that keep us alive. So we tend to think of these less tolerant species as insects, and they're just insects. They get on my windshield anyway. What need do I have of them, right? But they're the really important things. They're the stuff that actually matters.
Right. Yeah, I'm kind of just trying to take in what they're saying, and I'm actually, I have to say that I'm inspired by Extinction Rebellion. I'm inspired by Greta Thunberg and the kids that are saying, like, okay, hey, let's address this. But once you get to the point of addressing it, once you get to the point of the UK Parliament saying, okay, we've declared a climate emergency, you're going to have to go way beyond, okay, let's, we must take action. And, what is that action? What is the action?
And that's the thing. I don't know what the action is. I took radical actions that, as nearly as I could tell, nobody else was willing to take. I lived off grid, defecating in a bucket for a decade. I don't know anybody else who did that. And generated all of my own food, grew all of my own food, not a basil plant in the window, for crying out loud.
Right.
and enough food for several people in addition. I learned how to preserve food and all those things, right? I had this orchard, and it was beautiful. And then I recognized that with the aerosol masking effect, it doesn't matter.
Right.
You can't keep up. You cannot grow food fast enough if there's no pollinators. You can't grow food fast enough if there's not a living soil to grow the
Right.
food in.
Well, Roger Hallam said that he started Extinction Rebellion because he's an organic farmer, and his crops were being destroyed. He couldn't, basically, he was like, I can't farm. So what,
Right.
you can't grow your own food, then
Now, wait till we get a 1 or 2 degrees or 3 degrees Celsius global average temperature rise in the span of a couple of weeks when he's successful in destroying civilization. It's not going to work out nicely at all.
Right. It is a predicament, and it is, I am continually kind of trying to track, like, what is a possible path forward. I am obviously, as everybody is on some level, like, how do we stop this? How do we, what do we do about this? What are the actions that we could possibly take? And I have ideas of my own.
And I think everybody, or essentially everybody in the world, would actually, for the first time in history, come together, whatever that might mean, if we had all of the world's governments that came together. If we had Putin and Trump and
Xi Jinping and
100 other world leaders on the stage at the same time saying, we need you and everybody else to do these 35 things.
Right.
Then we might, but I don't see that happening. I think it's far more likely we get those people on the stage. Trump would trip over his own feet, land on a Korean person, and international warfare would break out right then and there.
Right. Yeah. And that is actually the largest barrier to taking action, is a coordinated human effort. Could we possibly even, align ourselves and logistically get ourselves together enough to take, all of the answers, all of the deep adaptation, or the Walter Jenny ideas, rely on the fact that we're all going to, have the UN say, okay, this is what we need to do. And everybody's going to go, all right, UN, thank you very much. We'll start that right away,
And there's some signs that we are able to do that. I mean, look what happened in World War II. When in the United States, domestic production of automobiles was suspended for a couple of years, when people were growing up to half of their food in their own yards, in victory gardens. And so it's pretty clear that people are capable of taking actions beyond what we initially imagined for privileged people such as ourselves.
Right.
That we can actually do that. And, I tried to set the trend for doing that when I moved off grid. And I showed the way forward, and I was uniformly laughed at. And that tells me a lot about the human response right there. But if it was beyond me, if it was every government leader in the world saying, if you don't do this, your children are going to die.
Right.
And that's actually the case.
Right.
And the problem is we don't know what do this means at this point. If you don't do this, your children are going to die. I think almost anybody, if you got a 15-year-old daughter or whatever, and you're told that if you don't do these 37 steps, I imagine you'd walk through fire gladly.
Yeah.
Or anything else that was called upon. But we don't know what those things are because of the aerosol masking effect and the catch-22.
Right. Well, I applaud at least the the ability of Extinction Rebellion and these other groups to at least, and even Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the whole Green New Deal movement, and like, at least they're bringing this to people's attention on a massive level. I mean, I've never seen there were actually, newscasts in London with Extinction Rebellion people on like primetime news. I was like, that's amazing. You would never see that in the United States, or you won't yet. But
right, I absolutely agree that
you know,
at least bringing it to people's attention, and that's what I think is honestly the best case outcome of declaring a climate emergency, is you're at least informing people that there's something happening out here that a whole bunch of people are denying, or planting the seeds of doubt at the very least.
right.
So yes, we have an emergency. I don't know how to deal with it, and I don't think anybody else knows how to deal with it in the form of a solution. But at the very least, let's tell people. It reminds me of a 1951 short story by Ray Bradbury that you can find online, if I could remember the name of it. I think it's called The Last Night of the World. And it's science fiction, obviously. Everybody knew that they were going to die tonight. Everybody on the planet knew that they're going to die tonight in their sleep.
Right.
And there was no outrage. There was no rising up. There was no people running around killing each other. There was no, and it went by time zones. So everybody in New York died 3 hours before everybody in California,
right,
in their sleep. And in the short story, in any event, there weren't a whole bunch of sociopaths getting on airplanes to extend their run by another 3 hours. And similarly, what was it, mid to late January of 2018, when everybody's cell phone in Hawaii said you're going to be dead
right,
in 10 minutes or whatever it was. And I didn't hear about people freaking out in a violent sort of way.
right.
I'm sure that people were like, ah!
Oh yeah, I mean, there were people jumping into like manholes, jumping into sewers, and like, I don't know where else to hide.
Right. And
there was not much you could do.
There's some professional golfer who was bunkered down into a bunker, literally into a sand trap, waiting it out there. But if you know there's nothing you can do, and at least you inform people that there's nothing that can be done, I'm not sure that when the moment comes that people would act with violence. That's what I hear all the time. That's among the most flack I get for my message is, if there's nothing to be done, why doesn't McPherson just shut up? And the reason I don't just shut up is because there will come a day when the water will stop coming through the taps and the food won't show up at the grocery store. And it could very well be this fall, given what's going on with the land hurricane or the cyclone bombs in the Midwest. Yeah. And when there's no bread, the civilization is not going to be maintained anymore. Every civilization requires bread and circuses. We're going to have circuses till the end. And so what I'm trying to do is remind people that they are mortal too, and they might want to live accordingly. And at some point, some really bad, nasty stuff is going to happen. How you respond to that is up to you, unless you have no warning at all. And there's a whole bunch of people out there who are not going to have any warning at all, because they've never even imagined anything beyond the infinite growth paradigm. They've never imagined that this whole set of living arrangements is going to go away. They've never imagined they might have to make a sacrifice somewhere down the road.
Yeah.
And that whether it does any good or not, that sacrifice might be called upon. So that's why I continue to do this. People tell me all the time that if people know what's going to happen, they will freak out. If everybody got my message right away, that people would freak out. Well, what are they going to do if they don't get my message? And then
that's the real freak out.
Right. Yeah. If almost nobody knows what's coming and then it comes anyway, that for me is the worst case scenario.
Yeah, I don't know if you are witness to any kind of like, I see people kind of understanding on some deep level that things are really wrong, and somewhat among my friends and family, somewhat among people I know, that they kind of have heard this message, or they understand that there's something over the horizon that is not very fun. That's about, and there's this kind of weird, I don't know if it's like a depression / anxiety, and I just see people kind of more acting out of this, And then there's people that are totally like, you know, meditating every day, and they're just like, just positive thoughts, guys, positive thoughts. Like everything is great. You know, I'm making all the money that I can make, and I'm in the best place ever in my life. And I'm like, man, I want to be you. I don't want to, you know, I want to meditate and just positive thought myself until the end. You know, that's totally what I would love to do, but I cannot do that. Uh, I think I agree. I feel like the more people understand what the predicament is, the less they're going to, you know, wake up one day and, oh my God, how come nobody told me? You know?
Right. And I think that'll be the most common response, is people going around saying, why wasn't I warned?
Right. Right. Because that's what they would be angry about, you know.
Of course.
Um,
Of course. It's not, I don't think very many people are going to be angry because the water stops flowing through the taps. They'll be confused about that, but not angry. They'll be angry that a whole bunch of people knew and didn't tell them, so they couldn't make appropriate steps, even if the steps are only emotional, are only intellectual, to prepare for that sort of thing.
Right. And unfortunately, I think that, you know, I think the hiding of information is just going on like full bore right now. You know, that you were, I wanted to actually ask you about this. Did you find anything? I saw this video and you were talking about UVC being measured hitting the ground, and so there are a lot of channels out there that have people sending in their UV measurements like all over the country, and I don't believe that they're making this up. Like I think these are actual measurements. You know, and they're like 10, 12. Or talking about like UVB or, you know, UVA. I don't know which readings are, but you know, UVC obviously is extremely dangerous if it is hitting people and hitting the ground and hitting insects and hitting other animals. So, did you find anything else out about those readings?
No, and I wrote to both of the lead authors, the first and second author of that paper that reported it.
Yeah.
And neither one of them wrote back.
Okay.
And that's weird, because academics always write back. If as an academic, you know, it's very, very difficult to get a paper published in the peer-reviewed literature. If you can find somebody who actually demonstrates some interest in your work, you know, you'll kick small children and old ladies out of the way to have a conversation with that person, especially if they're another academic. So just asking for additional info, they didn't even write back.
Wow.
And so I found that odd.
Right. Well, and with, you know, other reports or findings or conclusions like Natalia Shakova and, you know, other people that have come to some very scary, you know, come upon some scary information, and then suddenly they don't want to talk about it anymore. I never said that.
Right.
And I think, you know, it's hard not to be paranoid. That's what I'm saying for me, because I feel like, are they even telling us, you know, what the actual temperatures are? Are they even telling us what the actual, you know, humidity is in the air? Are they even telling us what the actual UV is that's hitting the earth? I don't, you know, on a lot of times I don't think so. And, you know,
no, I absolutely agree. We're being lied to all the time. And this is why I find Extinction Rebellion's one of their 3 pillars is governments will tell the full truth.
Yeah.
That's one of the 3 things they demand from their governments. Really?
Right.
You think that's going to happen because you demand it?
Right.
People have been demanding it in this country for 200 and some years. It isn't going anywhere. We aren't getting anything resembling the full truth.
We're getting less of the truth now.
Absolutely.
Less truth than ever.
Of course.
Right. Right.
We elect those people because they lied to us.
Right. And that's a really great point, because I think people really don't, you know, really understand that they don't want to deal with these problems. You know, they want people to tell them like everything's going to be fine. We're going to have more jobs, and we're going to be, you know, our economy is going to be great, and like they can. It's like electing you know, for Democrats, it's like getting a centrist Democrat into office. Somebody's going to go, okay, here we go. You know, we really care about climate change, and they, you know, do very little, you know, some tweaking. But all people want to know is that somebody's like talking, you know, saying the right things. And then they're like, I can go to sleep at night and feel much better about this. And they don't care that nothing's actually happening. You know,
most of us Most of us just want to know that somebody else is going to take care of this for us.
Right.
In fact, it's the entire basis for the word hope, is
Right.
that somebody else will take care of this for us. That's what hoping is.
Right.
It's not taking action by us. We're a little busy. I got
Right.
stuff to do. I got this podcast to put out.
Right.
I
Right.
got to make lunch today. I have all these important things in my life.
Right. Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's preventing, my living a regular life, or having to juggle all the plates of being alive, actually keeps me from keeps me from taking these, grand gestures, these grand actions that, I'd have to do in order to, in conjunction with everybody else. And
Of
I
course.
mean,
And that's, of course, that's by design.
right.
We
Sure.
have this set of living arrangements because it's all we've ever known. Why is it all we've ever known? Because somebody a long time ago decided if we can keep everybody on the treadmill and sufficiently occupied, they won't be asking a bunch of questions.
Right. Well, and the last time that we had people making a living wage and getting free college and having lots of free time, you had people in the streets about the Vietnam War and other things, and they were like, "Oh, we can't ever let that happen again."
Right. We had the American Cultural Revolution that was nipped in the bud.
Right.
And we're never going to see that again. I don't care if the official unemployment figure rises to 90%, and it never will. It'll never go over 5, as nearly as I can tell.
Of course.
Maybe 7. But,
Right.
but even if we get to that point, there is so much distraction to be had for the masses that it's, oh, geez. I don't think we could organize a parade at this point without government intervention.
Right. Well, and you can't, because you got to get a permit. And
way more than one permit.
Right. Right. Yeah. I like the Extinction Rebellion demands, and I like that they're trying to, wake people up, and it's inspiring to me on many levels. And I see the difficulty in actually getting those things to happen, and actually getting
right. And I wish just one of those people would come forward and say the words aerosol masking effect.
Right.
That's the only problem I have with Extinction Rebellion. I think they're doing an enormous service in that they are bringing the climate change situation to light, to the masses. They're in the newspaper every day somewhere around the country, and that's great. But let's go that next step and point out to people that reducing emissions will drive our extinction even faster than not reducing emissions, because of this connection between emissions and aerosols.
Right.
So let's do what they are demanding the government do and tell the full truth. That's what drives me nuts. Yes, they have generated a platform for themselves, and now is the time that they could introduce these ideas. They could tell people that we've triggered these self-reinforcing feedback loops, 60 or 70 or 80 of them. And we've also learned now about the aerosol masking effect. And there's this great paper by Rosenfeld in February of this year in Science, indicating that we've massively underestimated the aerosol masking effect. And he quoted the paper. They cited the paper by Levy and colleagues from 2013, indicating as little as 35% reduction in industrial activity drives a 1 degree global average temperature spike.
Yeah.
So why doesn't anybody talk about that? So Extinction Rebellion has poised themselves to be the go-to source of information about how dire the situation is. So now's the time. Step up to the podium and tell people living off grid is not going to help. Spending all this money to prep, whatever that means, and I know because I did it, is not going to gain you more than a few weeks. Right. That's it. So if you're willing to spend millions to get a few weeks, fine. But you got to be aware of the aerosol masking effect.
Right. Well, and that, is probably the two, one of the two things that we'd have to deal with. And the only way we could actually deal with it is if we had a political coordinated solution, right? So if we're actually going to reduce emissions and fight climate change and, cut out industrial civilization, then we're going to have to deal with the global masking effect or the global dimming effect and nuclear power plants, obviously. So you'd have to put all your resources into, okay, we're going to shut down these reactors and, so that we don't have any, because the grid's going to be faulty or non-existent.
Right.
And then we're going to have to figure out how we're going to compensate for this sudden rise in temperature.
Right. And so there are things
Huge
that
problems.
we can do.
Right.
Right. There are things that we can do to mitigate, to make for a better future, if not for humans, then for other life on Earth.
Yeah.
And I was very surprised, very pleasantly surprised to see recently an organization that I'd never heard of before and can't recall the name, that is going to buy Point nuclear power plant outside of New York City, which has got to be one of the more dangerous locations in the history of the planet to have a nuclear power plant.
Oh, yeah.
They're going to buy it and decommission it as quickly as possible. They're moving straight to cask and contain immediately. Right. The Indian Point has been running without a license for a couple of years.
I mean, it's barely operable, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But so again, this tells me that there's somebody out there with a lot of money, because there's no money in decommissioning. None. Right. So this company formed out of the blue, and they're going to do cask and contain of nuclear waste, nuclear materials. That's bizarre, and that's completely out of the blue, but it's great news.
Sure.
If we can do that for as many nuclear power plants as we have time for, that will certainly alleviate the impact of human life on this planet.
Yeah. And I think that we should do that. I mean, I think, we don't need just a president who understands that climate change is a problem. Like, we need a president who's willing to take our, most of our military budget, our, $600-700 billion a year, and go okay, we have this massive problem, and look at all this money we have. Let's take this money and put it over here, or at least bankroll, the decommissioning of all our nuclear power plants. Or
right. I would love for George Carlin to be wrong once. He said late in his life, we can't even take care of ourselves. Right. You think we're going to have some big government effort to fix anything? And so this would be a great opportunity to prove George Carlin wrong.
And who knows? Maybe there'll be some massive awakening. So on that note, I mean, what do you see? We have, Arctic ice. To go back to the Arctic ice, I mean, we still have Arctic ice, but it's extremely thin. So right. As I was talking to Nick Humphrey the other day, and we were talking about the fact that it's very thin, and anything could really wipe it out. A heat wave, a couple storms, if we may make it through this year. So
right.
What do you what and we also, on top of that, we have cascading extreme weather events. We have tornadoes, floods, we have crop failures going on. We have, we're seeing the results of the 1.5 degree temperature increase on the planet, which is not good. What do you see for the next, how long do you see us maintaining normalcy in the face of?
Well, normalcy has been thrown out the window in many places around the world already.
Right.
And including in places in the United States.
Sure.
You can't find very many small farmers in the Midwest who think this is normal.
Right.
It's pretty interesting, because that's a big part of Trump's base, is the small farmers in the Midwest.
Yeah.
And now we're seeing what is clearly influenced by climate change, these rain bombs or land hurricanes that are destroying the crop.
Right.
How long? Well, like I said earlier, it could be, and I'm not making a prediction here, but it could very well be that this fall finds the house of cards coming down, because grain prices become so high, or grain becomes generally so unavailable, that there's no bread on the shelves, or a very limited amount of bread on the shelves. I don't think we have the kind of society anymore that allows the president to go onto television and give this address when we're in the midst or on the verge of an emergency. I don't see the president stepping forward and saying, because of those land hurricanes, which were not driven by climate change, obviously, because that's a Chinese hoax, but because there is a very limited wheat supply and corn supply this year, everybody's going to have to tighten their belt a little bit, and we're going to have a hard time getting through this. You know, Americans did that in World War II by taking pretty radical actions. I don't see us having the kind of society today that will enable that without tremendous pushback. Maybe I'll be wrong, and I'd love that. I'd love it if President Trump would come forward right now and start planting the seeds, so that when we get into August or September or October and the grain failure is obvious, that at least people have been warned in advance. And then he can go up and say, all right, nobody gets to eat this week. I mean,
Right.
you know, in the 1970s, the days you got to buy gasoline at the service station in the United States were dictated by whether you had an odd or an even number on your license plate, and nobody got to buy gas on Sundays.
Right.
The gas stations voluntarily closed on Sundays. And
Right.
that was not very long ago, by the way. And it's difficult for me to imagine people at a large scale making that sort of sacrifice today, because we've come to enjoy this enormous amount of privilege. And some people want to drive a long distance on Sundays.
Yeah.
So I would love to think that we can not go back to those times, but go back to the attitude that sacrifice is not such a bad thing. We're talking about maintaining a set of living arrangements to which we've become accustomed.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't, you know, this is the cognitive dissonance that I see just in my, like, on my Facebook timeline, or in like, people are, you know, people are really hardwired right now to just do whatever they want to do, and for everything to be, you know, everything to be accessible, and everything to be normal,
Right.
you know. And I kind of feel like I can't, because it would just annoy people, but I kind of feel like you know, whatever, verbally shaking people, like, listen, you know, it's not, you're not going to be able to do this for much longer, you know, and I hope you're enjoying yourself, but, you know, you really have to start, you know, understanding that things are going to be very different, that there's going to be some hardship, that there's going to be some sacrifices, that, you know, you're not going to be able to, you know, do just normal things in the very near future, if that near future is even 2 or 3 years away. So,
Right. We've had a hell of a party. Let's just admit
yeah,
it. And
right.
the bill has come due.
Well, and I think the party, you know, people are partying harder than ever. You know, it's party hard time right now. It's like, let's go.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because very few people know that the bill has come due.
Yeah.
And they think somebody else is going to pay it anyway.
Right. And then we also have a normalcy bias, which is, you know, nobody's experienced, especially, you know, the younger generation, nobody's experienced, you know, they experience possibly some financial hardship, but there's no real lack. There's no lack of, you know, nobody knows what it's like to not have food on the shelves, or not have gas at the gas stations, or
to even have the gas stations closed on Sunday.
Right. Right. To, you know, not be able to, you know, and then they might have some hardships because of, you know, because of what's interesting is you have these disasters happening, and people are like, oh, you know, oh my God, that's, you know, that's really terrible. But, you know, we'll put it all back together. I was just reading an article yesterday about the military not having enough money because Trump is sending troops to the border, or directing money towards building a border wall that is taking away from their actual emergency mitigation efforts, right? So they actually are the ones that come and help people when Hurricane Andrew or you know, or Harvey comes through.
Right.
Right. So they're like, we don't, you know, he's actually messing with this whole emergency preparedness thing.
Right.
Which
So
is
they
ridiculous.
can't even respond when there's an actual disaster going on, because they're dealing with this fake disaster on our southern border.
Right. Right.
Color me shocked.
Right. It's, you know, and I don't know. I mean, I hope that, you know, I hope we have another a couple of years left of just regular living, but I don't
That'd
know.
be awesome. And I want to comment here. I lived in Belize for about 2.5 years. And in that 2.5 years, we were on the cusp, and we actually crossed over the threshold so that local people could no longer grow food. They could no longer grow the food that their parents had grown.
Yeah.
And that's why so I'm not trying to downplay what's going on the southern border of the United States at all. It is a disaster, but it's not a disaster for the United States. It's a disaster for people from Central America who are trying to get to a place where they can grow food, or where at least they can have access to food, because
Right.
that's all drying up in many places in Central America. So we have serious problems going on around the world that, for the most part, you and I, living where we do in what is still the land of plenty, we've been largely buffered from it.
Right.
But there are people close to us, I can promise you, there are conditions, and they're not talking about it, or their voices are being drowned out. Right here in the United States, people are beginning to suffer.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing it everywhere, and I'm just hoping that at some point somebody's going to have to say, and I don't know if I don't know if it's going to be Trump, or I don't know who's going to say it, but at some point somebody has to say, we're in big trouble. we're in a world of hurt, and at what point that it's going to be, I can only guess, and I'm assuming it might be soon. It might actually be soon, because we have economic problems going on, and we have.
Right. I mean, we're in the midst of a great economic contraction, the stock market notwithstanding. Right. So that's already happening. And if the young people we were talking about earlier are experiencing hardship, part of it is because of that economic contraction. So it's a lot more difficult to get a job today than it was when you and I were entering our career track, right? Because the system is unwinding, or the money is drying up, whatever you want to call it. So there are already difficult times facing people, and then you just keep adding on these individual events that result from abrupt climate change, that result from economic contraction, that result from the sixth mass extinction, and all of that points towards not very desirable outcomes for the medium future, much less the long future, and even for the short future for some people. It's tough.
Yeah. And I think actually, interestingly enough, Trump signed like an aid bill, but he said it was to help farmers because of the tariffs. So,
right.
Are you sure about that?
His administration implemented.
Right. No mention of the widespread flooding, tornadoes,
right,
crop damage, et cetera.
Talk about it. It won't be there.
Right. All right, Guy. Well, I think I'm going to wrap this interview up. We've talked for about an hour, and
that's way longer than most people can stand me. So congratulations.
It's always a great time talking to you, Guy. I appreciate you coming on. I hope I can have you back on again soon.
Of course.
Maybe in the next couple of months, and we can kind of reassess the situation and
talk about. It'd be nice to look at the grain situation in another month or two down the road.
Yes.
Because so far, we have numbers from the very beginning of the planting season. Things just aren't getting planted.
Right.
So they're at record low number of acres planted at this point. But how does that play out over the course of the next month or two? That's the important thing, is looking to the end of the harvest season.
Right. And I'm sure those projections are not going to be great, and how that affects everything, of course.
Right. And I mean, it looks ugly right now, but as we've seen with the Arctic sea ice, there's a lot of variation in the system, and things can turn around in a hurry for the positive too.
Right.
So that projection from the paper written in 2012 that relied upon its last data point from 2007 ends up we are almost certainly not going to have an ice-free Arctic in 2016 plus or minus 3 years. So sometimes good news is around the corner as a result of the variation in the system that we fail to take into account.
Right. Well, let's hope for bumper crops.
Thanks for the chat, Kevin. I appreciate it.
I appreciate it, Guy. Have a good one. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
All right.